Welcome back to Detailed, an original podcast by RCAT. This is a show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer for RDH Building Science, and your host. My guest today is Victoria, or Tory, Cuddy, Associate at PBDW Architects in New York City, New York. Tory has worked at PBDW since 2011 and proven her leadership on increasingly complex projects, finding a special expertise within new design and adaptive reuse. Most recently, she served as project manager for the adaptive reuse of the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Power Station for Powerhouse Arts, a new facility for the fabrication of large-scale works of art along the Gowanus Canal. She has worked for many years with the Park Avenue Armory on the restoration and adaptive reuse of this city and national landmark to create a cultural performing arts venue. Tory has completed several commercial and hospitality projects, including work for the Hotel Beacon and Equinox Fitness Clubs, including their flagship club and spa. She received her Bachelor of Arts from Amherst College, her Master of Architecture from Parsons New School for Design, and currently serves on the board of directors for the Westchester and Hudson Valley chapter of the AIA. The project we are discussing today is the Powerhouse Arts in Brooklyn, New York. This project emerged as a revitalization initiative born from the collaboration of PBDW and Herzog and DeMeuron. This 170,000 square foot facility serves as a hub for artistic production and community involvement, breathing new life into a historic structure formerly housing the central power station of the Brooklyn Rapid Transit System. Now, let's get into the details. Welcome back to Detailed. My guest today, I'm honored to have, is Tory Cuddy, Associate at PBDW Architects in New York City, New York. The project that we get to talk about today, I'm so excited, is the Powerhouse Arts project in Brooklyn. Tory, welcome to Detailed. Nice to have PBDW back in the house, the only firm that ever made me cry, in a good way. Thank you for joining me today to talk about this great project. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate being able to be here and share this project with you.
I don't know what it is, but I have had a number of architects on this show from New York, and I love it because it just seems like every project in New York is insanely interesting.
We have a unique set of circumstances given our lack of land.
Yes, you do. And that poses some unique challenges as well, which we also love talking about on this show. Yeah. So I always start the podcast with some randomly selected fun icebreaker question that for whatever reason I picked that day. So my question for you today is, what hard-won piece of advice would you share with your younger self?
I would say that there's no one path in this industry, that there are so many different skill sets that can be used, and everyone has their own areas of expertise, their own skill set that they really excel at, and to really embrace what that is and find your own path and ways to use that. That there's no one singular way to get to what you want to be doing.
Remind me someday to tell you my story. I could not agree with you more. We won't do that now because we're going to talk about this project. So seriously, there is so much going on with this project that I struggled with where to even start when I was reading through the project information. So let's start with a bit of history about this building. When was it originally built? What was it? And what shape was it in when you guys started this project?
So the building was originally built between 1902 and 1904. It had been designed by Thomas E. Murray. It was originally the power station that served the Brooklyn Rapid Transit rail lines, so the 4th Avenue subway in Brooklyn. And The building had two parts to it. It had a boiler house and then a turbine hall, and situated right along the Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn. And so barges would come in up the canal, which was a very industrial neighborhood at the time, still is a predominantly manufacturing neighborhood. They'd come up the canal and they would deposit coal on the site, which would then be taken up by conveyors into the boiler house, where they were then fed into 32 boilers, I believe, which powered 6 different turbines in the turbine hall, which provided the electricity to run train lines. In 1950, the boiler house was decommissioned, and that structure was actually demolished, while the turbine hall still stayed in use for another 20 or so years. In the 1970s, then the turbine hall structure was decommissioned, and it had a few intermittent uses, but ultimately by around 2010, the building was abandoned. It had been taken over by homeless youths and squatters and graffiti artists. And it became locally known as the Bat Cave. And so it became this haven for graffiti art, and they had raves at the top of the building. And it was really this iconic structure that stood sort of up high in the neighborhood for all to see. But it suffered tremendous deterioration. It had been exposed to the elements, and no one was caring for the building. And so we came in 2016. We had been invited to participate in a competition along with Herzog and DeMeuron, who we collaborate on this project with them. So they were the design consultant, we were the executive and preservation architects for the project. And so we were brought in to help them build their new facility for the fabrication of large-scale works of art. And so this includes metals, woodworking, ceramics, printmaking, and textiles, along with flexible gallery spaces, event spaces, and sort of multi-purpose fabrication spaces so that there could be collaboration between the different mediums within the space. So we were brought in to renovate the turbine hall, stabilize, restore the facade, restore the building. We had to put in a new concrete infill structure within the turbine hall, and then build an addition to supplement and provide sufficient program area for the rest of the building. And so that we continued the naming, that's the boiler house. And that's a new cast in place concrete building, red pigmented concrete building that sits right adjacent to the turbine hall. So that's when we came in, the roof had been removed from the turbine hall. Most of the windows had been removed, or there were a few still left in place of the frames, but the lights were all gone. Bricks had started to peel off from the parapets. In some cases, they'd actually blown off and were littered on the ground. The entire facade needed to be repointed. Because there had been no roof on the building, water had pooled on all of the different slabs and made its way down all the way to the cellar. It had just been in a real state of disrepair. Lots of biological growth creeping up through the brick layers. So it needed a lot of TLC when we got there.
Geez, that's not an understatement at all.
You should see the pictures.
TLC. Well, I have your pictures open next to me, but these are all pictures after the work was done.
That's true.
I did do a little. I always troll my guests and look on the internet at other information just to get a good feel for what that project was. And I did see some of the old pictures. And so TLC is a tremendously huge understatement of what you did with this building. So I understand this was an EPA Superfund brownfield site. Anytime the feds are involved, you know it's probably going to be at least somewhat complicated. How did this affect your project, and what had to be done about that issue?
So the remediation effort for the project actually began several years before we came onto the project. And so that was well underway with an environmental engineer already on board. And we worked very closely with them. That continued all through construction. And so they really handled sort of the paperwork component of things, the testing and the paperwork. And they developed a action plan for any time we were going to be dealing with any of that contamination. So the idea was to basically cap all of the contamination beneath either structural, not structural, but a concrete slab, or beneath a certain depth of clean soil. And anytime you went below that cap, we needed to follow this action plan to deal with whatever may be under there. So from a design perspective, that really informed how we thought about the site itself. And we wanted to limit excavation across the site. And that led us to thinking about reusing the existing foundation. So the boiler house and the turbine hall, they had shared a 6-foot thick mat slab foundation with essentially a forest of piles, wood piles underneath. And we did testing. We had to prove to DOB that we could do this and use this slab. But that really informed the massing and the footprint of the building, because we were using the existing foundation. So it had a real impact on just how the site developed from very early on.
It sounds like it. What did you have to tackle on this project? I know a couple things that immediately jumped to mind when I was writing my questions were the concrete mat slab, reinforcing the brick, the high water table. I'm sure there's others.
Yeah.
Tell me about the unique challenges of this project and how you solved them.
There were a number. I think for starters, we really wanted to have as much of the historic structure exposed, visible for the artists, for the fabricators, for anyone just passing by to have that experience. So we wanted to have the brick exposed, have the graffiti that had been there, keep that, have that patina remain on the building. There's these incredible lace columns that reach through the building, and beautiful trusses at the top, steel trusses with a rooftop monitor. All of this we wanted to have part of the experience for the artists and for the visitors of the building. So I think one of the initial challenges we had was trying to figure out how we could do this without having to fireproof all of that steel or encase all of it in chipboard or intumescent paint. And so that was one of the first things we were really looking at in our code analysis. And so we took a look and determined that by separating the two structures and giving them different construction classifications. So one is a type 2B. It can be of combustible construction. The other is the boiler house, which is a taller building. So that's a type 1 construction. By divorcing those two and putting a 3-hour wall between them, the type 2B construction, if we maintained it under 75 feet in overall height, then we wouldn't have to fireproof the steel. So then we started to look at the grading around the perimeter of the site to see, okay, what do we want that first floor elevation to be? What should the grade around the site be? And what would get us to the point where the grade is high enough that the building is below 75 feet for the average grade? And so we set that grade, and all of that steel is allowed to be, it was painted, primed. The rust that was there was cleaned and ground off. It had reinforcement where needed, but all of that's exposed and visible for anyone who comes into the space. And it's truly, when you walk into the Grand Hall and have that visual connection to the canal and to the space overhead, it's pretty phenomenal.
It is a beautiful and very impactful space. I have your pictures open next to me. I'm not looking away from you. I'm just looking at things you're talking about. It's just striking.
Yeah.
But it's gorgeous. And you have that old graffiti and that brick and all that beautiful wood.
And all of that can remain exposed. We didn't have to cover that with insulation. It was really important to us that not be something that's concealed, that the history of the building is very evident for anyone who visits. But we
Well,
also,
it's evident, but in a really, really great way. I mean, nothing is more boring than a square box building. I understand they serve their purpose, but there's just so much personality there just immediately.
I think another one of the challenges that we dealt with during this project was that the concrete pour for both the infill of the turbine hall and the new building was proceeding faster than the development of coordinated drawings from the MEP trades. So the design team had to always stay 2 or 3 steps ahead of the next lift of concrete so that we could determine, okay, we don't have coordinated drawings yet. We think it makes sense to put a sleeve here and have a box out here for this duct, and try to figure that out in advance of having any shop drawings to look at. And just working off of our design documents and what we thought would make the most sense, be most efficient, and keep the process of the concrete pour happening as quickly as it could. Because the concrete was poured into 2 different lifts. The boiler house had an interior structural concrete, 12-inch thick walls. And then using the same formwork after they'd gone up, they poured the red exterior width of concrete, which is another 6 inches of concrete. And so the concrete needed to happen on a very quick schedule owing to the weather and when it was going to get cold again and when they could get the truck with the red pigmentation. So we really were on a very fixed schedule for that, regardless of where the other trades were, and needed to try to stay ahead of that as best we could.
So, how much therapy did you need after that phase? I'm listening to you, and I'm like, wow, that's brave. That is really brave.
It's really brave for the owner too. Very, very impressive that everyone felt comfortable making these decisions together. And it took the collaboration and very close working relationship between the design team, the owner, and the contractor so that everyone was in it together and taking the same risks, but also able to sort of count on one another to make sure we got the result we wanted.
Well, I mean, it worked, so that I think that's a testament to just hearing you talk about that. All these scenarios of what kind of teamwork had to happen in order to make that happen are running through my head. And so I think that's a testament to great communication, which not every project always has. And it is a game changer, and having a supportive owner is a game changer.
We were very fortunate. It was a really strong team and very collaborative. Excellent communication between all members of the team. We worked incredibly closely with Herzog and DeMeuron, part of every meeting together. So it really was working as though we're all in the same office.
What was your overall design vision in programming for this building? Okay, you've got this very deteriorated building, and you know what you need to turn it into. Work some of that out for me. How did you, because I'm not good at visualizing things like that. Like if I'm decorating my house, you need to show me a picture. Yeah, I want it to look just like that. But visualizing it, this would work great there. What were the spaces that you need to make happen in this building, and how did all that come together?
So the program for the building really drove the design. The program and the functionality of that program, making sure that these workshops worked for the artists and fabricators that would be coming in and using them, was always at the forefront of any decision. And to that end, we really wanted to create workshop spaces that were safe and healthy. If you go to a lot of workshop spaces in the city and maybe probably outside of the city, they're found spaces. It's a converted garage or a converted warehouse or a converted this space or that space, and they're not designed for the function. So they never have the proper exhaust, and they don't have enough clearance for their materials, and they don't have enough head room height, or the lighting is not great, or there's a myriad of factors that go into this to create healthy and really workable, functioning spaces for these processes. So that was always at the forefront of our minds during design. But to that end, that also determined the distribution of workshops throughout the space. So metal and wood shops, they have the largest lengths of materials, the greatest weight to their materials. They needed the greatest headroom height. They had some of the most extensive exhaust requirements. And so we put those two shops on two different sides of the building, so they were separated, but also on the first floor, because then they're not having to rely on a freight elevator. They can just load in. Each building has its own loading bay area. They can load the material straight in. There's racks set right there so that they can deposit them. And then it was working through the workflow of each piece of equipment from one task, where do you take the material next? What is the next task? And trying to understand all of those steps in their process and what the needs are for each piece of equipment. Similarly, or contrastingly, the ceramics workshop is located at the very top of the building. And that's because we wanted to have the kilns vent directly through to the roof and not carry that ductwork all the way through the building. So ceramics is at the top, metal and wood is at the bottom, and then the second floor became administrative offices because it has the tightest floor to ceiling space and really doesn't need that expansive height where it's required elsewhere. And then the public space on the turbine hall side, the grand hall, is where you have that double height space with this mezzanine that wraps around. So it was really the program that kind of sorted itself out based on the needs of all of those different spaces. We additionally wanted to create spaces for collaboration between the different materials and the different workshops. So we have a lot of flexible space. It's not defined. There's not a lot of limitations on how that space can be used. So that's throughout the building. And it's really, in terms of the finishing and design, is about celebrating the building's history and allowing space for it to showcase its future on the existing building and on this new addition that's built there, instead it becomes this artistic hub within the community. So I guess that's a lot of parts to that.
Well, no, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. If I didn't warn you, I'll warn you now. I sometimes go down rabbit holes.
Sure.
Which I'm about to do.
Great.
So this question is not on your list. As you described all of that to me, and the needs for a ceramic studio and the kiln and the wood shop and all of these things, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, I've never worked on a project like this, so I wouldn't instinctively know that those were the needs. How did you learn that?
So I didn't either. We worked incredibly closely from the very beginning with fabricators and the owner to understand who was going to be operating within these workshops. And so we had interviews, we had working sessions, we had dozens of Excel charts with lists of hundreds of pieces of equipment detailing out the size of the equipment, the clearance requirements for the equipment, what the voltage requirements are, the exhaust requirements for that. Do they require, compressed air? Do they have a plumbing attachment requirement? All of this, that went on for rows and rows and columns for each workshop. And through working with them on a very intimate level, I think we were able to really dial in on those needs. And they reviewed, we went back and forth and they reviewed the layouts. And Herzog and DeMeuron did, I think, a quarter scale physical model of the workshops with all the equipment there so that they could see how it would all lay out, which was really helpful too. And everything was modeled three-dimensionally as well so that we could share that with our engineers, and it would indicate where we need power attachment, where we need a hookup here, where we need a hookup there, where we need clearance around it. So it was a learning process. I don't think any of us came in with very extensive knowledge of the operations within any of the shops.
But I think that's a really key lesson for anybody working on a project type that maybe they haven't done before, is you can't just say, I think this is what they'll need, or make assumptions about things. You have to talk to the people that live and work in that space, in that type of space, and find out all the things that you did, and what kind of equipment do you need, and knowing that you needed you needed the main floor because of large pieces of wood and those kinds of things. And that doesn't always happen. Oh, you have an architect that, all the best intent, but this looks like this will work. It'll be a really cool room. And then nothing works in that room.
The organization had done something really incredible, I think, too. They started satellite workshops before the building was built, so that they actually had some of the workshops up and in operation, because it's a brand new not-for-profit. And so while they were building the building, they started a workshop in Red Hook, and they had a textile workshop, they had a ceramics workshop, and they brought in experts in the field that we met with regularly. And so they looked at what we were doing, and they advised us on what was going to work or what wasn't going to work. And even though it seems like this makes sense, it really doesn't. And they were quick to point that out, which is immensely helpful.
Well, and it makes an immensely useful building when they get it, by having that. I was going to ask, did you actually meet with any of the artists?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
The print shop in particular, their workshop, the professional print shop is it's on the boiler house. It's in one of the middle floors. But they opened the shop under Powerhouse during design. And so Luther Davis, he is the master printer there. And we met with him. We had many meetings with him. He basically has a bespoke workshop that he was able to tell us exactly how his workflow is, where he wanted each piece of equipment, where he wanted us to build a washout booth, where we needed racks for drying, how he was planning on using the space. And now for other print shops, they come to Powerhouse and they're looking at that as a model for how to build a workshop, both from the workflow, but also from that health and safety standpoint, because we were always talking about what are the materials you're using? What are the chemicals that you're using? How do we handle these? How can we improve that process and make sure that the space is as clean and safe for the occupants as possible?
I bet those artists that are operating out of converted garages or just, the spaces that they find are really jealous when they come here.
Well, there is a community component to the program, which is great too, that they have several of the workshops have a community area where you can have a membership and rent space so that others have access to the space too. It's not just professional artists and fabricators.
Do they have, is this a form of an event venue as well? Like, do they have shows here? Do they do stuff like that?
They do. So in the Grand Hall, you've got that photo, and in the loft, and probably downstairs, and even the entry lobby. And they've got a small hall, a gallery space. So they've got spaces for the display of artwork, for lectures. They've had banquets. They've had major artist installations in the Grand Hall. They had a music video recently filmed there at the Grand Hall. So they've had a lot of events there, and I think that dovetails nicely with the programming when those spaces aren't in use for fabrication.
Well, it's the first thing I thought looking at that Grand Hall space was great place for an event or a music video. I hadn't thought of that, but the minute you said that, I could picture about 20 artists I like. So we talked about this a bit. So basically, it sounds like this building has just been sitting there deteriorating since the 70s.
Yeah.
Pretty much is when it really stopped being super, super used on a regular basis. And I love that it got nicknamed the Bat Cave. And the graffiti artists, did all this stuff here that you've preserved quite a bit of. How did you use this deteriorated building to your advantage? Because I think I would have taken one look at it and said, oh, heck no. That's going to be way, I'm still amazed every time I look at it that anybody chose to move forward with that, because it just seems like it would have just been so complicated and there's just so many things to deal with. How did you use all of this deterioration to your advantage in the design?
I think there was a lot to work with that was just incredible. And to demolish that building would have been just so heartache inducing.
You're not invested, are you?
It just has these amazing industrial details, and the building was really well built. It just had suffered quite a bit. So we really looked at it. It was an opportunity to reestablish something that had been there. And it was an important building to the neighborhood previously and remains so. I think it was a really special, unique set of circumstances that this building was able to be preserved. I think it would be hard for a private developer to look at this project, look at the remediation requirements, look at what it would take to save that building and say, yes, I can see how I'm going to make a profit out of developing this. And so the project was really blessed by the philanthropist who really invested in the building and in its program. And so I think it was really a fortunate confluence of events that preserved this. And so what's amazing to me is that for those who are probably not as familiar with the neighborhood, Gowanus in Brooklyn has always been a manufacturing neighborhood and major industrial thoroughfare because of the Gowanus Canal. And so in recent years, there's been a major shift in demographics, a major shift in the zoning that's occurred, which has really pushed out a lot of the manufacturing and artistic uses that used to have a home in the neighborhood. And so by preserving the building, keeping the building as a manufacturing center, fabrication center, we've preserved that original use within the neighborhood too. So it's not just the building, but manufacturing as a, I'm trying to think of the right word, but manufacturing as an activity is still preserved. So it's sort of preservation on a couple of different levels, I think. And we've restored the original massing and relationship between the two buildings and the site that had previously been there before the boiler house had been demolished. So I think that it's fostering this ongoing manufacturing and industrial activity along the Gowanus Canal. I think that's just something really special about the project too.
I'm just rabbit hole again. Just curious, was there a grand opening? I would have loved to have seen the look on like some old timers that had lived in the neighborhood for a really long time, and maybe some seniors, to see the look on their face to see it brought back to life.
I think there's been a lot of interest in the building. They opened to the public. The official opening was, I think, last May. And then they've been opening studios and sort of workshops in like a phased process over the last year. I think people have been pretty impressed by the space, by the restored space, the stabilized, restored turbine hall, but also the workshop space that's available, and the quality of that space, I think, is very impressive.
I would imagine it's also because it's not a place anymore for squatters or things that could cause issues in a neighborhood, that it's also really helped that area maybe elevated that area quite a bit, in
There's a
taking away that spot,
there's a
that it used to be.
I think that Powerhouse is also, though, very conscious of their responsibility and role in the neighborhood and in the artistic community. Um, and so one thing that they've done that I think was really kind of cool, there was this piece of graffiti that is pretty incredible. It was at the cellar level, now it's at the entry level. But it's this "You Go Girl" wall that's featured in the lobby. And they found the graffiti artist who had created this. And for the opening, they'd invited them back to the building and then commissioned them to create a new work of art, which now is in the Grand Hall. And so they've always had this respect for the artists who were living there still, and for what they brought to the building and their history. And we're not trying to erase that either. That's just as intrinsically important to the building and the community.
What a great way to kind of to meld that together and make this new space, but keep even that part of its history.
And to honor it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because it's gorgeous. Okay, let's talk about, we'll work our way outside in. So let's talk about the exterior design and elevated grade first. What are some of the key things you were looking to accomplish with the building exterior design? And how did you accomplish it?
Sure. So the overall building site naturally sits higher above the adjacent properties. And so it's sort of naturally elevated on this plinth. And the ground floor elevation is at 9 feet above the floodplain elevation. Again, we're right next to the canal. So that was important to us. But really part of determining what that first floor elevation was going to be had to do with what I mentioned before about determining the average grade so that the building could be below that 75 feet. But it was also working from the bottom up to ensure that we could provide parking below, which was required by zoning. So we needed a minimum distance underneath that first floor slab so that we could fit vehicular traffic. And so that really, those two things sort of came together really nicely to establish what that grade plane was going to be. And now, because it kind of sits higher, it's sort of this beacon in the neighborhood, sort of calling back to that industrial past. In terms of the rest of the building, it was really a stabilization effort for the turbine hall. It was about stabilizing that facade. It was not a strict preservation project. It was not landmarked at the time of design. But we didn't want to remove the graffiti or clean the graffiti. We wanted that to still remain and be part of the building. That was just as important. And then we have this new cast in place pigmented red concrete boiler house addition to the turbine hall. And the red pigmentation picks up the red tone from the brick. The way that the concrete was handled, there's a roughness to the texture so that it's not an out of form concrete building. Also really has a great relationship with the brick, and it doesn't feel sort of like this new appendage to the old building. It feels more established. But we also looked at the historic imagery and we looked at the turbine hall and used that as a reference for how our windows were going to wrap around the building and to create that unified facade across all sides of the building, using those same scaled windows, which are quite large. They're modified slightly to function for the workshop, which is different than how they needed to function when it was a power plant. But it was really about sort of creating this unified whole and not feeling like an extra add-on. And then even at the top of the boiler house, the historic structure had two very large stacks for the boilers flues. And instead of that, we have these two MEP towers on either side, where we have all of our condensing farm and we've got all of our fans on the other side. And so it's still sort of harkens back to what that historic massing and form had been.
So I'm curious, how exactly did you stabilize and repair that brick facade after being neglected for so long? How do you do that without taking it down and building it back up?
So all of the copings on the parapets have been lost. The brick assembly's inner and outer wides had both begun to peel and bow away from each other. And as I mentioned earlier, there was extensive biological growth that needed to be removed that had caused severe cracking. Base bricks had fallen out of the building and fallen out of the exterior corners of the building in particular, where there had been rust jacking at the corner columns. And so a lot of those corner columns, brick columns needed to be rebuilt, and almost the entire facade was repointed. But great lengths were taken to match in kind the bluestone trim, the mortar, the multiple historic brick types, many of which had very unusual shapes and finishes. And they were even slightly different dimensionally to the bricks we use today. So trying to figure out how to weave those within the facade was also, something we mocked up and took great pains to understand and figure out how to do that best. We did minimally invasive testing on the masonry, including freeze-thaw tests, metering cracks. We did a modified pull test. The focus, though, was really on stabilizing the structure and celebrating the building's changes over time, rather than bringing the building back and the structure artificially back to its original appearance. The masonry wasn't overcleaned. It was, rather than removing the graffiti, this layer of history was really celebrated. It was preserved. And it was about recognizing that this artistic past of the building and its industrial past should be incorporated in part of this new design and folded in and integral to that.
I love that they could choose to do new graffiti. I mean, I really do. I mean, it's a part of the heart of this building. I would think that, at some point they might have a section or have a competition or something and do
But
new
during
things
construction,
over the
we
years.
found new tags. And so we're not looking to remove them. That's just part of the building's history now. And even now, you can think of the tags more broadly. You're going to have the layering of the materials that are being used in the workshops as this next layering of graffiti on those walls.
So it probably will be an ever-changing building.
I hope so.
So at the cellar level,
Mm-hmm.
I read this and I was trying to picture exactly what I was reading, and I'm not sure I got it. So I'm going to ask you instead.
Sure.
At the cellar level, there's an open parking deck, which I read includes small windows around the perimeter of the cellar that are open to the exterior to allow for the occasional incoming of floodwater. I read that twice. Like, did I really read that? I personally have never seen, I mean, I'm in Oregon, high water table. We also have a river right down the middle of our city. So used to water issues,
Mm-hmm.
in a state where it rains all the time. But I've never heard of somebody doing something like that. Tell me about that.
I mean, it was kind of actually a straightforward approach. We decided for a number of reasons to not house any critical infrastructure in the cellar. Part of that was because we didn't want to have to penetrate that mat slab more than required. So most of our services are up on the roof. And if there is a flooding incident, we aren't worried about any critical infrastructure being damaged because of that event. And then the decision was, there are these historic small windows that march along the facade of the turbine hall. And so we have an insect screen. There's metal grating that's there. But we didn't put in lights because this way, if there is a superstorm Sandy event, if water comes in and there's no infrastructure there, it can just be pumped out. And it's really not impacting the operations of the building or the people working there at all.
Great way to solve that problem.
It's just...
Okay, so let's go inside the building. We've talked about some of the spaces more broadly. It sounds like there was some preservation of historic elements in the building. Obviously, some of the things that were already like built into the facade.
What?
Um, what, besides the actual structure, what, if anything, were you able to salvage and reuse?
So when we came to the building, there really wasn't anything but the building, but the structure. Um, so the turbine hall has these masonry walls, perimeter exterior walls, and then there were turbines that sat in the middle on these cockpit bases, very, very large. There were no floor levels inside the turbine hall. Instead, there were historic mezzanines that wrapped around the perimeter for maintenance access for the turbines. And then on the far east of the building, there's what we're calling the annex. And it's a smaller alcovey space at the back, smaller floor to ceiling heights. There's a lot of really interesting industrial architectural moments there that we were able to preserve and highlight. There's this incredible brick. We're calling it the corduroy wall. There are corduroy walls throughout, and that's where they actually housed the conduit that was powering the train line. And so you've got this corduroy brick, you've got the graffiti, you have these arched slabs and the historic steel and these lace-up columns. And then there had been these illegal infill floors that had been built, I don't know, 1970s, 1980s. No one really knows when they were put in, that had been put in to create a first, second, and third floor level. And so that was the condition we found the building in. But they were not structurally sound. And so we immediately pulled those out. But all of the historical structure around that, we kept everything we could. We reinforced the steel that needed to be reinforced. We took coupons to see the state of that. We had areas where it was isolated repair or replacement that needed to happen. Areas where there was crumbling deck or, the steel was not in great shape and needed to have a length replaced. But for the most part, we were able to keep all of that as much as possible and keep all of that exposed. So it was really the illegal infill stuff that had no historical significance that we were able to get rid of. But I think I alluded to this before, the building was not landmarked when we began design. And that was one of the interesting challenges and sort of like details of the process, that it wasn't until we were in construction that the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission decided to designate the building as a landmark. And what the designation is the approved DOB drawings. So it's not returning it back to the original structure, but they said that the designated landmark is the exterior facade of the turbine hall based off of the approved DOB drawings. So it's a really unique designation. It was unique timing. And because of that, there was a lot of confusion on everyone's part about what, just from a paperwork perspective, what needed to happen and who needed to be involved. But we worked closely. Anytime we issued a bulletin, we would review that for appropriateness with the commission. And I think that it worked out very well at the end, but it was just a very unique timing and condition to be designated. Very unusual.
It seems like that would be a bit of a panic moment, at least at the outset.
Oh, yeah.
Like, wait, we're under construction. And because we all know what happens when you get a historic designation. There's a whole different set of rules to follow. So how does that affect a project when it happens while you're building it, that designation comes through?
Right.
I think everybody'd have a little bit of a heart attack until you had the conversations. And so did you have to substantially change anything?
No, because they have approved what we'd submitted for the design. That was the designation.
So it's really, I'm trying to balance that in my head.
Yeah.
You know where I'm going, right? I mean, this deteriorated thing was the historic building, but what they've approved for historic designation is the newly
Is
done
the,
thing.
the
The
repaired
newly,
condition,
yeah.
the restored condition. Yeah.
Well, one of the
But then
beautiful
any changes
things,
we made to that, we needed to review with them for appropriateness.
one of the beautiful things because of that is the building is now protected, from somebody coming in later and just ripping it down. Not
Oh my
that
goodness.
anybody would, I know, I'm sorry. I meant later, like 50, 100 years from now or whatever, if somebody,
Yeah.
For whatever reason ended up with the property, it'll be a little bit harder to take that history away.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great thing. I absolutely, I've probably already said it 5 times, love how you found a way to incorporate all those years of graffiti art into the actual interior of the building. Tell me what kinds of things you did with some of the other interior finishes in this building to work with this structure and this history and this, that gritty feel to this space, because I'm looking at it, so I know. But what I would like you to do is tell me about the other interiors you chose and why you chose those to go in this space.
Sure. So the graffiti itself, we really had a light touch to preserving it, to handling it. It was just a dry brush to remove any loose pieces and just let it be. And there's no sealants on it. That really wouldn't be within the ethos of the building and the program, which is to allow the history to just evolve with time. In terms of the quality of the spaces for the boiler house and the turbine hall, there are 2 different things at play. There really aren't a lot of finishes in the traditional sense. There's not a lot of adornment. It's really the graffiti. The finishes are there to provide a robust environment for the processes that are happening in the workshop. So it's just the exposed CMU block and concrete walls. There is no need for chipboard, which is going to get banged up and destroyed in, a couple weeks' time with the material and the lifts that are coming in and out. Like that didn't make sense for the building's operations. They would be constantly doing touch-ups and fixing things. So it's a really very industrial space. The turbine hall, because it is the historic building, and you're pulling from that red and yellow and buff brick colors, that's what the finish is throughout. And then the gray concrete is any infill new structure that you see. So all of our shear walls and columns and slabs are this new gray concrete. So there's a real obvious interplay of old and new that you see. The boiler house is all CMU block or gray concrete on the interior. And again, it's about providing robust finishes for the kinds of wear and tear that they're going to get in those workshop spaces. The only place where there really are more refined finishes are the administrative or public spaces, the front lobby, where we have introduced a warmer wood bleacher and reception and vestibule to the palette. And then on the second floor administrative spaces, the second floor has the storefront. And again, we're looking at the painted steel to inform the color of that red storefront that you have, so that there's also transparency between the workshops and between the conference spaces and the offices. And that's the sum total of the finishes.
Well,
the graffiti is highlighted in the existing building, and actual structure is highlighted, and it's all serving more than one purpose. It's the finish, but it's also the structure, and it's the insulation in between. And you've got this exterior red concrete wall. It's doing so many things, and it's providing a really tight thermal envelope.
okay, in the entry lobby, the wood floors are still a game changer. But I love how much it warms up that space, because it
Yeah.
really, and I like the concrete floors as well in the grand hall. But when you enter it, it's such a perfect blend of that old and new. But it just feels like a warm embrace looking at it when you're walking in. It that piece does not feel, even with all the elements around it, over the top industrial. It feels like a welcome space, and then you move into the other spaces. I can't.
But it's a salvaged wood floor too. So that's.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I thought for sure that was a new wood floor.
It's new to the building, but it has a history
to that building.
Well.
It's really new. Yeah. So, what would you say, in your just your personal opinion, is the most unique space in this building?
Well, the grand hall. I don't need to think twice.
Easily. Gosh, those views. I need to come to New York. I really do. So, what did the process look like to get this building permitted? Because I cannot imagine that was easy. Tell me about the challenges with that, and what you did to make it work.
We have a lot of experience with complex project filings, with the building department, with landmarks, with SHPO. This project really wasn't any different. I think for this project, the larger challenge for us was really diving into the operations of the workshop and understanding the way those materials and the equipment need to move through the spaces, and providing all the necessary infrastructure for each piece of equipment. So I think that for us was actually the more challenging part than the filing process with DOB. I mean, that took a while, going back and forth and explaining what we were doing and how we were handling the grand hall occupancy, being at the top of the building, and the stair size sort of limiting our available occupant load. So we worked very closely with our code consultant to develop a strategy in creating a horizontal exit in the building, so that really allowed us to expand the program that could happen in that grand hall. So there were things like that were really critical for us to dive into early on. We also worked with a fire code expert that helped us as well in dealing with this. We have this communicating stair that connects the lobby floor with the grand hall. And so we were looking at how we can ensure that this is not an atrium space, which would trigger all these additional requirements. So there are a few key things that we needed to hone in on really early on in the process. But sort of once we figured that out, they just sort of became facts that we worked within. And I think that's sort of the strategy we would have with any project, sort of figure out what are your limitations and what can be actually an opportunity within that.
Well, that's good to hear. I like to hear the occasional story where getting a project permitted was not pain-inducing.
No more than any other.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they all have their special, unique things that go on.
Yeah.
Let's talk about construction a little bit. I'm always excited about that question in any interview, because it's where the rubber meets the road. You take your design, and now is it all going to work the way you designed it? I'm really excited about asking that question on this project, because I just struggled to picture, with all the different conditions going on here, what construction looked like. So what I like to hear are the good stories of something that happened during construction and how you navigated your way through it and figured out your solution. Because I've worked on enough renovation, nothing like this, but enough renovation and adaptive reuse types of projects in my career that you always discover something you didn't expect to discover. How was the construction process, and did you hit any roadblocks or situations that forced you to pivot?
Yeah. I think very early on, we knew this was a roadblock. We needed to figure out what the mat slab could support and how we could prove to the Department of Buildings that it could support what we were proposing. So we worked very closely, our wonderful structural engineer, Silman, and Langen, our civil engineer. They developed a load test, which we presented to the Department of Buildings, that was signed off on, where essentially we had to do some early demo of those illegal floors that I mentioned earlier and shore and brace the turbine hall structure. And then over a period of 9 months, after clearing the boiler house slab, exposing it, clearing it of all soil, and then actually drilling holes 5 feet on center along the whole of the mat slab to perform grout injections because it's sitting on muck. So we need to make sure it was on, solidly supported. We then, over about 9 months, loaded soil onto both the footprint of the boiler house and the footprint of the turbine hall, 40 some odd feet high, with vibration and optical monitors measuring any recorded movement on the slabs. And so this was done in a series of lifts. 25%, we waited a few days, then we did another 50%, 25% above that. And then you held it for a bit, and then we unstacked in the same sort of regimented order. And for 9 months, we did this in the boiler house. Then we moved into the turbine hall, which was hard because there was all this shoring and bracing, and they're working in this confined place with these trucks trying to move soil about. There was a neighbor across the canal who was living in a residential building who had a blog and wrote something to the effect that, I don't know what they're doing over there, but they spend a lot of time moving dirt. And that's what was happening for 9 months. Soil was being moved from this pile to that pile to that pile, and then trying to find a home for where all this soil could go after it was on the contaminated site also delayed things because not everyone would take that soil. So that was a whole design and execution to enable the process to go. And meanwhile, we were still working on construction drawings and early construction processes without having this final determination that we could proceed. So again, that's where it's really important to have everyone's buy-in early on how this is going to work. So that was, I think, one of the first opportunities we all sort of had to get together and see what we've got. We also were building during COVID. So I think construction stopped for a couple of weeks, but not that much more. We had exposed rebar and other structural things that we were permitted to continue working during COVID. But that definitely changed how things worked on site and how many people and how that all would operate. So I'm sure the GC could speak more fully on how that affected their operations on the day-to-day. But I think that definitely was a unique time to be in construction.
I got to admit, I've never heard a story like that dirt story before.
Yeah.
That's a lot of dirt.
It was a lot of dirt. It was twice the proposed load of the new building and turbine hall.
And then to take it all back out.
And find a home.
And clean it all. And they obviously found a home.
Yeah.
But that extra challenge. Yeah. That extra challenge of it being on the contaminated soil. And so, you can't probably just pick it up and go take dirt wherever they take dirt.
Yeah. There's also the challenge of the site. And so the site plan is rather unique for a number of reasons. So the main site is along the canal, but that's not adjacent to a major road. There are these sort of two fingers that reach out that are both the property of Powerhouse, but one is just the half width of a street and the other is a private road. So the site circulation for trucks, for concrete trucks, for deliveries, for all of that needed to be really carefully orchestrated. When you're trying to get soil on and off the site, just added to that complexity.
Every project includes lessons learned. I've been doing this a long time, and I have yet to encounter a project I work on that I don't learn something from. I would guess the list from this project is probably pretty endless. There's just so many unique things going on here. What would you say that your biggest lessons learned were going through the challenges of this project that will make you a better architect on the next project of a similar nature that you do?
I think I feel like I keep saying the same thing, but it's having as many people engaged early on in the project, whole team, the occupants of the building, the owners of the building. If you have facilities managers, their involvement, contractors, all the design team, having everyone early on providing their expertise and their guidance, they may see things in a light that you would never. And so it allows us to think more critically about our assumptions, and you're going to have a more successful project the more you listen and really actively listen to what they're saying. And you can also, you learn so much from working with all of these people. We would have weekly meetings for over a year, twice a week for the whole morning, if not longer, to coordinate all of the MEP infrastructure. And this was all the subcontractors, the GC, the design team, engineers, architects, and we would all be there during COVID on Zoom. Every single conduit, light fixture, duct, flange, hanger, every single thing was modeled three-dimensionally so that we could make sure that it all coordinated together, that it was all going to be exposed in the final condition. So it needed to make sense and be orderly and organized, but also it needed to provide the clear height space we were doing. It needed to make sure that the lights ran in a cohesive way and provided even illumination throughout. It was to ensure that if there's a problem, someone who's working there can quickly identify that's where our problem is. So that's another reason we don't have ceilings. You know, it's a maintenance thing for the building. So having those sessions taught me personally a tremendous amount about all of the real nitty gritty of that infrastructure, which was, you know, I'll be forever grateful for that. Really incredible.
That's priceless. It really, I've worked in most of my career in architecture, but I've worked in a couple of other disciplines as well. Well, now I work in building science, but I worked in MEP for a while and I worked in construction for a while. And the lens that gave me in my career is completely different because of having this exposure to how the other half lives, so to speak, that you work with every day, but you don't necessarily walk in their shoes or get to hear them tell you how they need to walk in their shoes. So take it, this was, if the contractor and the major subs were on board early, this wasn't a traditional design bid build.
It was. This was happening during construction. And so we were going floor by floor, you know, as we were installing, we're working on the floor below. And so this was an ongoing thing happening during installation.
Well, that's a better time to get those lessons, is when it's actually not just when talking, you actually get to see it happen. What would be the number one piece of advice that you would give another architect who was thinking about taking on a project as complicated as this one?
I would say that it really is a balancing act between getting into the weeds and the minutia of all of these little details on the equipment and how it's all going to operate, and then poking your head out because you need to see the forest through the trees as well. And so you really have to balance between the two and make sure that you're not getting lost one way or the other and missing something.
So what's next for PBDW? What projects can I look forward to having you back to talk about?
Well, our firm specializes in the intersection of old and new, historic preservation as it meets new construction. Although the breadth of our work really encompasses everything from high-rise hospitality to institutional projects and education facilities to single-family residential projects. So we're currently working on an office to residential conversion in Midtown, and a fair number of hospitality renovations. We also have another preservation adaptive reuse project that I'm working on now, several school renovation projects underway. And we're also continuing our work with Herzog and DeMeuron on another significant institution in the city. So we have enjoyed a very close and ongoing working relationship with a lot of the institutional clients. So we can't always speak candidly about what that project is out of respect for their privacy, but we've got some exciting things in the works.
Well, I know that I first met you, your firm, for that cook school interview, and I just thought that was the most mind-blowing school. I really did, on so many different levels. Not just
it's really thoughtful and it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful from the outside, but the care and feeding and heart that went into the design of that school, I think, spoke volumes about your firm.
Thank you.
I really do. And so I was really excited to hear I got to have another PBDW person come see me. We always close out every episode with a couple of closing questions, and one is a broad industry question. So for you today, and I don't know, maybe it's just the interviews I'm getting recently, but I feel like I'm hearing about a lot of extensive and complicated adaptive reuse types of projects. More so than I've heard about in a really long time. In your opinion, why do you think there is this renewed interest in bringing buildings like this back to life when it felt like for a long time it was like tear it down and build something glassy and shiny.
New and shiny?
Yeah. Why do you think that seems to be changing?
Well, I think it's really great to hear and see this developing. I think the environmental impacts of creating a new building where an existing one already exists are becoming better understood by both the industry and the general public. We now have ways of better measuring the impact of adaptive reuse projects and tracking embodied carbon and avoided emissions. And now we can document and understand our impact on the environment. So I think it's easier for us, not easier, but we are able to make an informed decision with our clients and consultant teams using those metrics. So I think people in general are more aware. I think the population, maybe it's social media, maybe it's just we're also connected, is they're more aware of adaptive reuse. They're more aware of sustainable practices in general. So I think it's really great to hear that. And it's a shame to tear something down when it's just got this history that you could reintegrate into a new life.
I'll tell you, I love big shiny buildings, especially the big glassy ones that reflect the clouds. I think that's the coolest looking thing in the world. But I'll take a building like this with this personality and this heart and this character over a big shiny building any day of the week. So if this is really becoming more and more of a thing, I'll be the first one to celebrate it. and clearly you will too, because I just watched your face on a couple of my questions. But tear it down. It was like it's like I hurt you. And I think that care and feeding shows again in this building.
Yeah.
Final question. Everybody gets this one. I think we all hope to live a life that leaves some kind of contribution in one way or another to make the world a better place or to make an impact on the people around us or whatever. Everybody's different. Personal or professional, what do you hope your impact will be?
I hope to leave the place better than I found it. You know, I think this became particularly poignant to me during this project because I had 2 babies during it as well. And that raised my awareness that I'm not thinking just about me, but about the future and how that's directly going to impact the next generation. And so little decisions can make a big impact and have an effect. And so I think if I can continue to try to lead by example wherever I can and just even just a little something to make things better, I will feel happy with that. It'd be great if I could do something huge. But I'm little moves can have a big impact.
We were just meant to meet today. One of my favorite things to tell people is at the end of the day, it's always the little things that make the biggest difference.
Yeah.
We may not directly see that difference.
That's okay.
You do this thing here or this thing there, and it ripples, and those ripples get bigger down the road. We may never see it. We may never hear about it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Right.
But it's sometimes harder to day in and day out do a ton of little things as it is to do one big thing because it's a commitment. And so I couldn't agree with you more. Tory, thank you. This has been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for joining me. You are welcome back anytime. You have a project, just call me up. Say, Cherise, I got a good one for you. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having us.